Last week on May 18th, the Department of Labor issued its final rule implementing some significant changes to the overtime regulations. These final rules implement some significant changes to the rules governing the white-collar exemptions under the FLSA. First, and I think most significant, is that these regulations increase the minimum salary threshold for determining exemption under the FLSA administrative, executive, and professional exemptions from around $29,000 and change to $47,476. So I think a lot of companies were quite familiar with the proposed rule that was issued last July, and with this final rule that came out last week, there was a little bit of good news. There was some uncertainty whether these final regulations would include any changes to the duties tests under the FLSA exemptions. But in fact, the final rule does not include any changes to the duties tests. Employers will be allowed to use up to 10% of non-discretionary pay or incentive pay, such as commissions, that they can use towards the minimum salary requirement of $47,476. These final regulations provide for an automatic increase to the minimum salary requirement every 3 years, whereas the proposed rule included a mechanism for an upward adjustment of the minimum salary every year. One thing that I think that all of us thought, because that's what the DOL was telling us, is that when these final regulations were finally issued, the companies would have about 60 days to implement the changes. But actually, employers have until December 1st, 2016 to implement these changes. So while this may not be great news, at least we have the better part of 6.5 months to help companies implement these changes. I think the last important component or highlight of these final regulations is that it increased the minimum salary requirement for another exemption, which is the highly compensated employee exemption, from currently around $100,000 to $134,000. But what's really important to emphasize for Pennsylvania employers is that Pennsylvania does not recognize the highly compensated employee exemption. So for all employers out there in Pennsylvania, you do not have to worry about this rule. But on the other hand, if you currently have anybody that's exempt under the highly compensated employee exemption, make sure to review those exemptions because, again, Pennsylvania does not recognize that federal exemption. So from today until December 1st, 2016, when companies have to be compliant with this new rule, we will continue providing our members with various resources and guidance materials to help them implement these changes.